Well, welcome, friends. I'm here with a good friend of mine, Leroy Chambliss, the Reverend Leroy Chambliss from Ohio, Dayton, Ohio. And Leroy and I served together for how many years, Leroy?
8, I think.
As clergy at Stillwater United Methodist Church. And today we thought we would just do a conversation on race. Leroy and his family showed up at Stillwater one Christmas Eve, and they were maybe the first African-American family to actually stay. They came to worship, and then they came back. And so we'll come back to that in a minute. But Leroy, would you just share some reflections about maybe even where it started today? What's it feel like to be an African-American man in America, a Christian man in America? How are you dealing with the issues of race?
Well, in today's environment, it's reflective of what was taking place back in the late 50s, 60s, and early 70s. And really my hope, not only as an African-American male, but as a Christian man, was that the progress and the movement that we had that eased the tension around the idea of race would continue forward. And it seems at this point, I'm a little bit disappointed, a little apprehensive that it seems things that I grew up with learning as ways to interact with my fellow human beings is not the norm anymore. I mean, name calling and lying and a variety of things that just in the household that I grew up in were just not acceptable. I just want to say that I grew up a lifelong Methodist. My great-grandparents were charter members of the church in which I grew up in. So from a foundational standpoint, the only thing I've known has been Methodism, and I didn't have a choice about whether I'd be one. But
Tell me about that for a minute. I'm thinking about, you grew up in West Virginia.
Right.
And was your home church a predominantly African-American church? And if so, or was there an Anglo-Methodist church also in town?
Well, it was primarily African-American church. We lived on what was called the Hill, and the majority of the people in my community, African-American people, lived in that community, either on top of the hill, which is where my family lived, or in the holler or up the holler. So it was a segregated community to the point that the first 8 years of my elementary school education, it was 100% black teachers, black students, all from my community. And it's only when I went into the 9th grade that we actually followed through on the movement from the Civil Rights Act that went in place to actually integrate the schools. So that was the first opportunity I had to, from an educational standpoint, to be in an integrated environment. But the church, as I said, it was an African-American church. Bishop Marilu was the circuit rider that chartered that church. So my family were very active members from its inception, and up until the time that the district decided that the church was no longer viable, and the congregation went into, I'll say, closure. Yeah.
All right. As you think about that time as a kid in a small town in West Virginia, when were you aware for the first time of your own race, that I'm an African-American male?
Well, I think, as I think about it, we were like truck farmers, I'll call it. So most of the food we raised, we had pigs and chickens, and we had a neighbor that had beef cattle and cows, which Mr. Woolwine, which was a European American, white man, that we exchanged food with, traded, barter, whatever you want to call it, and we're the only two families that lived on the top of the mountain. There didn't seem to be any tension in the fact that we were living there. We didn't have any barriers that really actually separated the land ownership. I mean, we farmed our portion, and he farmed or grazed his stock on the portion that he owned. I think the first time that and I had to be pretty young. My grandma, my great grandmother, took in laundry, and she was sort of a matriarch of the community. I'll say a midwife. A lot of the children in the African American community, she was there when they were born. Everybody called her Miss Bit, and her name was Bentley. But I recall that that when some people came to pick up the laundry, that they didn't call her Miss Anybody. They called her by a nickname. And I mean, it wasn't black or Negro or anything like that, but it confused me a little bit because the African Americans in the community had great respect for this lady. And it was the first time I heard someone not address her by Miss in front of whatever they called the name that she would be called. So I think at that time, 5, 6 years old, I was just aware that there was something different.
Mm. You've raised a son and a daughter, and what's it like what have you had to do that might be different than I've had to do with my 4 kids as a parent of Black children in America?
Well, I'm gonna say, I think it will be, I have to go back a bit to my early childhood. And as I said, we had a small farm. And in the smokehouse, I found some shackles. And I didn't know exactly what they were per se, but I asked my great grandmother, where did they come from? And those, she was born in 1865. And I was blessed to be 13 years old when she actually went to be with the Lord. But they disappeared, and we never had a conversation around that. So, and my grandmother was an educator. So my exposures and to how I interacted with society, I got from them, my grandmother, great grandmother, and my grandfather. So with my kids, it was always never anything about my Blackness. It was just about how to be, be confident in yourself. I had an aunt that told me to keep my shoes shined. My grandma was saying, always walk with your head up. And they didn't say because you're Black or anything like that to do that. So with my kids, I've always encouraged them that they could be and do whatever they wanted. I will say that they were brought up in an environment that was a multicultural environment. They were raised in Southern California. So I'll say some of my latent racism had to be overcome to fully allow them to engage in community with people that were very different. We were the only African-American family in the community that I lived in, not saying that it was a Black and white community. There were Asians, there were Hispanics. So a very blended community, but I'll say very middle class in Southern California. So I just encourage them to trust themselves, be faithful. They could do what they wanted to do. I mean, chase your dream primarily, without any built-in negatives about other people, put it that way. Now, I won't say they didn't pick up some, but kids are kids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you, sometimes we hear that African-American parents have to have the talk with their kids. Is that a reality? Is that true? Did somebody have to have that with you?
Oh, yes. I mean, not just the respect of the law, but to recognize that although they're to protect you, you could be hurt. Perception of who you were. I think while I was very conscious to how you dress, what you look, it was a very conscious thing. So, myself in my teen years, as well as going through the late 60s, knew that interfacing with people in positions of authority could be deadly. So, of course, with my son, traveling around Southern California, being a surfer, hanging out at the beach, I'll say that 95% of his friends were white, and the other 5% were anything other than Black. So he was always in a crowd where he would stand out. But at the same time, there are many things I'd say. First of all, I don't have enough money to bail you out to get yourself in a lot of trouble. Be respectful of law enforcement. And be conscious of the fact that you are a black man in America. I won't say I did that initially, but as he grew up into his teen years, it was very necessary for me to have that conversation. I would say that with his demise at Florida State University, where he went to school, was due to the fact that he was an African American in a situation that was compromised, and people that he thought were friends pointed the finger at him being the culprit in it. And we got through that. Not any big adverse effects, but it was just a reminder. And as a kid, when we moved to Middle Tennessee, and he asked a young lady to go out, and she said she could be his friend, but she couldn't go out with him because he was black. And he came home crushed because the time in Southern California and his growing up, he had never really been rejected because of his color. He was a kid that worked at Disneyland, Capitol Records, and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think racism is regional in a sense that you've grown up in West Virginia, you've lived in Tennessee, Ohio, California? Is it across the land? Is it different across the land? What's your thought?
Well, to be honest, I think it shows up in different ways across the land. It is different. I think that in West Virginia, we were all hillbillies down there in southern West Virginia. My grandfather was the head cook at the hospital, so we had a lot of interaction with the people that were professional people there. My grandfather greatly respected, and I used to tag along, and he'd take me and the Depp boys, pair of twins, white twins, and we'd all go fishing together. I'd be at the house, I played with them. Not until I got into junior high school and did the idea of black-white fighting become an issue, because I wasn't brought up with that. I was brought up in and our church also worshiped with a European American congregation in my community. So my exposures as a kid growing up were in environments that were not confrontational or identified by the fact I was black and they were white. But I found that living in different parts of the country has presented some different issues, and racism doesn't always show up because of the color of your skin. It can be hidden around finance or profession, or it just depends. It becomes matter of fact, I think you can handle it better when it's hit you right in the face rather than some of the subjective ways in which you can find yourself being a victim of it. Now, I want to say in the midst of this, I too found myself as a racist. I didn't know this, but some of the work that I did in coming to terms to being who I hope God has called me to be, I found that I had preconceived notions about people that were Asian. Not because I'd ever met one. I didn't meet an Asian person until I moved to California. But I'd watched a lot of John Wayne movies. And they were war movies. And the way they talked about people of Japanese ancestry or Chinese or whatever were in negative terms as I look at those movies today. Subliminally, that goes into our subconscious. And you'll find that I found that as an engineer working with a friend that we ended up being really good friends, played tennis together. When I first met him, the thought about culturally or who he was not about his culture, but a name that would, if I said it out loud, it would have been offensive to him. I didn't learn it at home.
I think part of this journey is we often don't know what we don't know.
Right.
And until we have a different context. And one of the stories I tell on myself is early at Stillwater, we were still in that first part of the building, and I preached one day, and I told some story about being in Jamaica and trying to buy a painting, and I said I Jewed them down on the price. And I told this story, didn't have a thought about the verbiage until afterward, when a member of the congregation pulled me aside and said, "Pastor, you can't say that."
Yeah.
And I was dumbfounded. I mean, here I am. I'm a college graduate. I'm a seminary graduate, but I had very little Jewish friends, and I had never connected the word Jew it down to Jews. I had never connected it. I had always heard it as that's a great deal.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's how, and so when they said, "Don't you understand that that's related to Judaism?" and I was like, "What?"
Yeah. 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 That's a perfect example of how we, in just the cluster that we grow up in, the things that you hear that, I mean, particularly as young people, that we just take as norm and not think it offensive. Like you said, this is a win situation. I got something at a better price than that was the same thing. In moving to California, and they called Mexicans wetbacks, which was a real interesting term. I'd never heard that, and to give me some explanation about what the word meant about coming across the river and all this, but I immediately knew that it was a derogatory term because I have to think about my own journey, being in the late 40s. I mean, I think at that time, African Americans were considered colored, and then it was Negro, then it was Black, then it was African American, in addition to whatever offensive name that you want to come up with along with that. So I've watched the transition in our country as to how people of African ancestry have been referenced. And when we talk about that and where we are today, that is what probably disturbs me more than anything else, because it seems like we have undone much of that work that was helping us move forward. We have lots of issues still to go. I think that the church, though, should be in the forefront of that because it tells us that, we're all one in Christ. But I have to say, as a clergy person myself, I probably have not preached that message in a way that it resonates to the point of really causing change in the hearts of those that I was proclaiming the message to.
I remember a conversation you and I had somewhere along the way, and where I said something to the effect of, "Well, I don't think of you as African American. I think I probably went on to say, I don't see color." And you said to me, "But everywhere I go, the first thing people see about me, Duane, is that I'm an African American."
Yeah.
And I don't have the privilege to not be seen as an African American. And I remember thinking, oh, I thought I was doing a good thing, right?
Yeah.
And you reminded me that you almost made me say, you have to see my color.
Yeah. Well, I think that that we have to see all the parameters around who an individual is. And color is just one that just hits you right in the face from the beginning. I know that while I was in seminary serving a church, first cross-cultural appointment that I had, wasn't even sure that it would work because of the community this church was in. But it went there and ended up being a very positive experience for me. But as you said, I had one of the matriarchs of the church says, "I don't see you as Black." And I just said, "Whoa, I hope you do," because this should help you. I mean, if you can accept me to the point of saying that, and I knew it was deep from the heart, it was supposed to be a compliment, but it's not just me. Just think about, I mean, you can, because you've gotten to know me, you feel about me differently. And I think that in race relations, that's what we as people have to do. Myself, I've never served an African-American congregation. I will say that I've gone to churches and they asked me after I preached, I remember particularly, so how did it feel to be the only Black person here? And I said, well, I see a lot of diversity. I mean, not everybody in that church, although they may have the same skin pigmentation, are the same. Matter of fact, when you talk about the country, I mean, in different areas of the country, different groups of people settled those areas. They may all look alike, but there was tension amongst these different groups as they settled the land. But it's easy as human beings for us to be able to try to find that person where we can find commonality insofar as difference, that you can say, well, there's no difference, but in truth, you know that there is, so it's just hard. That's why the idea of around cultural awareness and racism is just so tough. It's hard. There's none, and it's in the Bible. so it's something that says that you really have to take work. And I think Jesus, in his proclamation, talking about that they all be one, was overcoming some of that cultural, racial discord that took place amongst the people at that time, and knowing that we will continue in that even today until that day when he comes again and we see him face to face.
Yeah. Good stuff. I was thinking as you said that, I feel the burden, a burden when we see our world do things to people like George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, when the names the list gets longer all the time. And I'm very comfortable with the phrase Black Lives Matter. How are you doing when you read those headlines, and what should churches do around issues like Black Lives Matter? For some people, that's a political statement, and they'll, I can't agree with everything that this organization does. For me, it's the statement itself that says we got an issue that is not working, and until Black Lives Matter, we can't move on. What's your thought?
Well, I wish they could have figured out a different way to say it, because I think the lowest common denominator in that whole statement, Black Lives Matter, is a deep issue, because the legacy of slavery, this difference, this even built into not being fully human, this impacts. If you talk about Black Lives Matter, if you stop and say, if you can, in fact, understand that a Black life is as valued as anything else, how can you not say that a Asian life or a Cuban life or, a Spanish life, whatever, has value? So that Black Lives Matter is really inclusive of all people of color, putting it to the lowest possible common denominator. I think that misrepresentation of those that are in power of what that phrase is has taken some of the strength out of the depth of feeling and necessity for recognizing that Black lives do matter. And I say that you come back and hear people say all lives matter. Now, I'm a Christian. I know that. But I also know that there was always someone that was looked at as enemy or different, and until you can embrace that, you're able to create harm in the lives of people that are lighter shades than Black. Black is just a denominator, a color, and it really doesn't define African Americans, because I've seen very few Black people. I'm not going to say I haven't seen any, but I've seen very few. I think that awareness in our country, having gone to Haiti, Mexico, been to Africa and Cuba, and looking at the dynamics of race in those environments, as well as having to be able to be reflective to find out something about myself, has helped me be able to understand the depth of what it means, that statement, Black Lives Matter. And confusing it be. My cousin wrote a book, Cream to Cold. And he was a foreign correspondent in South America, and he was confused because there he saw people that looked like you, friend Duane, that had a card that said they were Black, and saw people that looked like me that had a card that said they were white. And he was totally confused. He grew up in North Carolina, and he wrote a book around that to try to work through something that was just totally foreign to his understanding of Black and white.
Mm. What would you say? What do you say to the idea? We hear this word right now a lot: systemic racism. what would you say to people about systemic racism?
Well, in a capitalistic system, there has to be winners and losers. And the system itself is built in such a way that there are just that, winners and losers. In that, unfortunately, our egos tell us that there has to be somebody less than. And being less than, if you build it into your socioeconomic systems, that is systemic. And in our country, whether we want to admit it or not, all you have to do is study the American history, look into the Constitution and see how this was built. You start to understand, yes, it is systemic. But it wasn't just for Black people. There's systemic racism built into the system that covers a whole group of people other than Blacks. And the recognition of that is the only thing that will unravel it. Really, we have a lot of work to do as a nation to remove a lot of systemic injustices that are underpinning the system in which we live. And I want them to hear that having traveled, there's no better place to live than in the United States, but that doesn't mean it's perfect. We have work to do. And matter of fact, we have more work to do sometimes than people in what we would call deprived or challenged countries around race anyway.
Yeah. What do you, if I remember right, you have 4 grandchildren? How many grandchildren?
3.
3 grandchildren. And biracial grandchildren.
Yep.
What have you learned about having multiracial grandchildren and or your kids marrying into multi-ethnic families? What do you learn? What did that teach you that you didn't think? I mean, you thought maybe I already knew that, but now I know it differently.
Oh, absolutely. I think that that has been a leading edge, a growing edge in my life. My family is very diverse. Prior to my kids getting married, the thing that struck me most unusual was that when my son was marrying a white woman, I didn't think anything about it. You know, it was okay. Matter of fact, we had conversations around some of the challenges they would have, as well as the challenges that their children would have. When it came to my daughter and she introduced me to the man that she was going to marry, I found a whole different set of things going on inside of me. And to the point of looking for faults in this person that is my son-in-law. He was a fine young man, but I didn't know. My own latent racism came to the surface when it came to my daughter. And I don't know, and I think that was the backdraft of the culture I've been raised up in. And again, like I said, there are all these subliminal things that are part of us that until something hits it, you don't know anything about it. But the conversation that we had is that although my daughter and son are married to others, that their kids will be identified as Black. And my concern mostly was for my children. I mean, to my grandchildren, as they, I think it was my middle granddaughter. Somebody was asking her, a friend asked her what she was, and she says, "I'm white and I'm Black." A truth, but that is not how the system will look at her. Although she's blue eyes and got blonde hair, she's still Black.
Well, we've gone about 27 minutes. What are some things you would say to the average Anglo white Christian right now that they can do to help our nation move forward and to be aware of their own reality? Nothing like a softball.
Yeah, that's a fastball and a curve. I think that first of all, we have to understand what we mean when we say that we're a Christian. We have to believe in the gospel, and I mean the whole gospel, and the gospel is one about assisting and helping those that are less than to come to equal footing. I think that we have to be, and I'm saying we, inclusive, true embracers of a gospel that doesn't see color. So as a Christian, it's very hard for us to take a politicized view of our fellow human being, because one earth, one people, human beings, and it's not easy, but we need to be able to live into that and let everything else be secondary, because that is the goal. I think that, wow, I'm not a sage, but I do think that as white Christians in a country that is at a moment in the discord of itself, that we have to stand not on political expediency, but we have to stand on our faith. And our faith just doesn't allow us to be Democrat or Republican, liberal or conservative, but the best of all of those, for us to live into the fullness of the faith that we're called as citizens.
Thanks, Leroy. That's good. That's good stuff. I want to ask you two more things. One, think about, and I'll come back to this later, is there a book or something you're reading or something you've read that you'd say, this, I think, is a gift to all of us to deal with these issues of race, maybe other than scripture, but you certainly pushed us there. But the other thing is, I think you and I've had the conversation that Cathedral of the Rockies, the downtown campus, I discovered when I got here 9 years ago, a window, a stained glass window that at the top had George Washington, which I thought, oh, that's interesting, Abraham Lincoln, and right behind him, Robert E. Lee. My first thought when I walked in was, oh, they're all Methodists. And then I did my quick history in my head and went, nope, I don't think any of them were Methodists. And even doing our homework here, looking in our archives and talking to people who were here 60 years ago when this building was built, the only thing we found was it was kind of a nod to American leadership, a nod to reconciliation, and a nod to white Southerners in Boise. Now it's 60 years later, and that window's there. If you were attending here, what would your thoughts have been when you looked up and saw that window?
Probably similar to when I stood in front of Stone Mountain, Georgia, when I looked at that and people flock around to see it. And as a Black man, knowing that much of the life and actions of those folks that are carved in that mountain were not beneficial to me, person. So I know it's our history, but I think that particularly in a church that we have to be careful what we display. As the church goes, I mean, we're not supposed to, our Father is God in heaven. We are not supposed to, I look at Robert E. Lee as a political figure, not something identified in the church, because it was a divisive time of our nation and people, and all those statues. I'm not saying tear them down, take them away, or anything like that, but just have to have the recognition of what was real in that context. And these people served their country and their constituents, I think, well, but at the same time, that is not the country that we want to be.
Yeah, yeah.
And those things, as an African American, are hurtful, really.
Yeah. Did a book come to mind at all, or something you would suggest that people gravitate toward as they seek to educate themselves and grow into the likeness of Christ?
I think you told me you were going to ask that question. I'm going to say there are two books.
All right.
One is You Are What You Love. And I have the book, but I haven't read it myself. But it's been on my it's on my book table to read. And I'm trying to get the title. I think it's Breathing Underwater. And that's written by a Franciscan monk, Richard Rohr.
Oh. All right. I haven't seen that.
So I would say that as Christians, we need to be able to take a look at other faith groups because there's some good stuff there as well.
Great. Would you be willing to, well, I think we're going to call this a day. We survived. And we're thinking that maybe next week, if we can figure out the technology, we might come back and have one more discussion on race, but maybe taking some questions together that people have either sent in ahead of time or that people can send in while we're live. So that's kind of the plan. I'll plant the seed here with folks who are watching kind of Mental Health Monday. And you can even put a question now in the chat if that's something you want to do. And that gives Leroy and I time to prepare and actually think about it, which we would appreciate because we're both.
Right.
And we would maybe be able to have a better answer. But in a week, we hope to come back and have some time to go a little deeper on some questions around race. Can you offer a prayer for those who are watching or who have watched, and for those of us that are following Christ as we seek to be a light in this interesting time in our world?
I read a quote. It says, "Now to him who has given us hope in believing." Matter of fact, it says, "will abound in all joy and peace." My closing prayer would be, "Oh God, the God of hope, help us to be able to live into the fullness of the belief in the gospel of Jesus Christ, the unity of body that is called one body in Christ, that we can be all that you would have us to be to your glory in transforming not only our lives, but the world in which we live. And we will eternally give you thanks." Amen.
Amen.